Her Senator's Second Chance by Cindy Ray Hale. Copyright 2020 Cindy Ray Hale.
Chapter 1. Adam's drive down the sun-dappled streets of Maple Creek, Virginia was just as much a trip down memory lane as it was a stop on his re-election campaign as a Virginia state senator. Other than a few stops for official campaign business, he hadn't been home in ages. Even on those trips, he'd spent as little time as possible in the small town. He usually did his best to avoid spending too much time in his hometown. Too many memories. Too much pain. And he had work to do. He straightened his necktie and looked away from the row of historic homes with large porches lined with rocking chairs and potted plants. His sister and assistant, Jenny, took a left onto a side street past a cherry tree in full bloom, and Adam asked, "Where did you say you booked the fundraiser dinner again?" "The Whitmore house." "I haven't been there since our cousin's wedding years ago," Adam said. It was the oldest, grandest building in town. The mansion was now turned into an events venue and was Maple Creek's premier spot for weddings. The thought made him groan internally. "I have my own wedding to think about now. I don't know what I was thinking, planning a wedding during my campaign. But it can't be helped. I know you think Darla's the perfect catch, but I have to disagree with you. Even if she is the daughter of a well-loved former U.S. Senator, or, according to Fred, exactly what you need to gain the support of the fickle Virginians who were undecided on their votes. I don't get to be picky, Jenny. It's a wonder I got elected as a single guy." As the days ticked by, closer to Election Day, the pressure was mounting, and a fairy tale wedding to Virginia's sweetheart Darla Pickens was just the edge he needed to beat out the competition. He should be happy, but he owed it to Darla to put to rest any lingering feelings he may have for Natasha. He'd dated a lot of women over the years, but he couldn't seem to move on from the girl he'd dated throughout high school. It was ridiculous. He should be able to close that chapter of his life. And now was the perfect time to do so. Jenny pulled up in front of a white mansion with a magnificent porch lined with white pillars. It was even nicer than he'd remembered. The paint shone brightly in the afternoon sun, and wicker furniture with bright pink and green cushions lined the veranda. Was the venue under new management? A woman in a floppy straw hat emerged from the house and climbed down the steps as Adam exited his vehicle. The moment she saw him, her face lit up, and he wasn't sure whether to smile or groan at her excitement. Mrs. Wheaton, the town gossip, and while she was entertaining, he was already behind schedule, thanks to the chatty constituents he'd met with earlier that morning over breakfast. "Senator Larson. What a pleasure to see you home," she said in a thick southern drawl. "And sweet Jenny too. It's always so nice to see you in town." Jenny rushed forward to hug the woman and stepped back to allow Adam to greet her. Adam approached the old busy bee and took her hand. "Mrs. Wheaton. The pleasure's truly mine." She pumped his hand, the fat beneath her arm shaking vigorously. "It's been far too long. You really need to come back to see us more often. Walter," she called out to her husband who was just climbing from their Chevy Malibu. "Come on over here and say hello to Senator Larson." Walter, his old high school chemistry teacher, was a stick figure of a man, his face war-torn and weathered. Probably from years of marriage to Mrs. Wheaton, Adam thought with a chuckle to himself. "It's a crying shame that we have our very own senator, and we never get to see him." Adam gave her a wide smile. "You're right. I ought to be ashamed. I promise to come back more often. Next time you do, be sure to stop by for some of my homemade cherry pie." She reached out and squeezed his bicep. My. You used to be nothing but skin and bones. The good Lord's done blessed you." Her arm lingered on his upper arm and caressed up and down, squeezing her fingers into the back of his arm. He stepped back before things got too awkward. "I'd be delighted. You know I could never turn down a slice of your pie." Walter hobbled up next to his wife, back bent. The last 10 years really hadn't been kind to him, but as he gripped Adam's hand, his handshake was strong. "Mr. Wheaton, it's wonderful to see you again. It's good to see you've done something with your life. I'll be honest with you. I was concerned that you might not have amounted to much when you blew up my chemistry lab. Adam chuckled. But I still made an A in your class. Well, that was because I didn't want you retaking my class the next year. Mrs. Wheaton piped up, when I heard you were returning home for this fundraiser, I knew I had to come out to support you. Why, I was just telling Natasha Jenkins this morning it was about time we saw you again. Whatever happened between the two of you? I always thought you'd end up marrying her. The entire town did, really. Not this Darla Pickens. She made a face like she'd tasted a glass of lemonade that needed more sugar. He barely avoided flinching at the mention of Natasha. It was wonderful to see you again, Mrs. Wheaton. I'm afraid I have to attend to some things inside. Natasha. Of course she was still living in Maple Creek. He couldn't imagine her ever leaving. She was the real reason he'd been away. He'd wasted way too many years being heartbroken over her. He couldn't afford to worry about Natasha anymore. He had a campaign to run and a fiancée to think about. Darla was more than enough to keep him busy with her high demands. Adam followed Jenny into the large white mansion. He hadn't been to the house since senior prom. He'd taken Natasha that year. It was the last time they'd kissed. He'd told her he was in love with her. Then everything had fallen apart. She grew cold, and the next Monday she broke off the relationship. He'd been devastated. But he left for college soon after and made it a habit to return to Maple Creek as little as possible. The memories were too painful. He shook off the unpleasant thoughts as he crossed the foyer with the massive staircase and sparkling chandelier. The dinner will start in 30 minutes. We have you set up in a room where you can prepare for your speech. Jenny led him through the house, past a bustling kitchen. The door swung open, and a woman carrying a tray full of vases with flowers bustled through, crashing into him. Water and flower petals exploded in the air, splattering all over his Armani suit. Glass shattered onto the marble floor, and he looked straight into the bright blue eyes of Natasha Jenkins. Adam. Surprise registered on her face as she recognized him. A wave of shock jolted through his body, and he stood motionless, unable to speak or move. His heart pounded, and his words stuck in his throat. She quickly composed herself. I'm terribly sorry, sir. A waitress emerged from the kitchen with a towel and began cleaning the mess. Time stood still, and the chaos of the moment silenced as he took in Natasha's slender form. He curled his fingers into his palms to keep them from trembling, and he forced himself to slow his breathing. Inhale. Exhale. It's fine, really, he said, looking down and swiping uselessly at the water splotches on his suit. His first instinct was to look away from her, but he shoved it down and met her gaze head-on. He was a Virginia state senator. He'd faced much tougher situations than this. Natasha was more beautiful than he had remembered. He'd been careful to never look her up on social media, and now he could see he'd been right to avoid seeking her out. She'd been a knockout in high school, and now she was all chic refinement with long blonde waves that brushed her elbows. She grabbed a towel another staff member offered her and began wiping at the water that had splattered across the starched white shirt she had tucked into a sleek black pencil skirt. Aubrey, please show Senator Larson and his assistant to his room and provide him with a hairdryer for his suit, Natasha said. Adam's brow rose at her authoritative tone and the clear knowledge she seemed to have of Jenny's job on his campaign team. What exactly was her role at the Whitmore house? He tried to speak, but he couldn't think of anything to say. Now he sounded like a stuttering fool. Yes, ma'am. A girl with red hair twisted into a ballerina bun stepped forward and ushered him to a room down the hall. He followed her numbly, glancing over his shoulder to get one last look at Natasha. She stood in the doorway of the kitchen, poised in her heels with a single strand of pearls around her throat. And she was looking right at him. A shudder ran down his entire body as their eyes connected. She brushed off her shirt with a towel, turned on a 6-inch heel, and clicked back into the kitchen. Goodbye, he said awkwardly over his shoulder as he followed the redhead. Not looking at where he was going, He stumbled into a brass vase and knocked it over, sending a loud clanging noise echoing across the marble floor. He reached out to set the vase back in its original position, but Jenny stopped him. "You keep going. You've done enough damage here. I'll fix it." He followed the redhead to the room, and Jenny joined him shortly. He closed the door behind her and turned to his sister. "Did you know?" "Know what?" "That Natasha would be here." "I may have been aware of that," Jenny admitted. Jenny was well versed in Adam's history with Natasha and the long string of women he dated in an attempt to move on from her. "And you didn't think to mention that?" "Why? Does it bother you that she's here?" Well, no. Of course not. What is she doing here, anyway?" "She's the owner." "So you booked the venue with her directly?" "Yes." Adam eyed her suspiciously for a moment. "Is that why you chose to have my dinner here?" "I can neither confirm nor deny the validity of that accusation," she said with a half smirk on her face. He rolled his eyes and said, "Typical." He could feel his old teenage angst bubbling from his stomach to the top of his head as he contemplated the implications of what his sister had done. "Well," he said, "I guess there's nothing I can do about it now. I'll just have to avoid Natasha at all costs. And don't you get any funny ideas about how to throw us together. My wedding with Darla is in a month, and I don't need you ruining it. Her family has already spent $10,000 and countless hours on this wedding. My feelings for Natasha are long gone. It's called history, sis." "History?" "Yeah, right. I saw the way you looked at her in the hall just now. And in that pencil skirt. All I can say is, wow. She has legs for miles, and the best way I can describe her is she has, quote unquote, blossomed." She put her fingers in the air in air quotes. "It's a wonder she's still single. You ought to see the heads turn as she walks down Main Street." "Whatever you say. I still need to put the finishing touches on my speech. And I won't have Natasha as a distraction. I have a career to focus on."
Chapter 2. Natasha stood in front of the sink of the small powder room, dabbing at the water splotches on her shirt. That would have to be good enough. She didn't have time to change. Her cheeks flushed as she recalled how embarrassing it had been to crash into Adam like that. Way to make an impression after all those years. He must have thought she was so unprofessional. It was a wonder he even had decided to book his campaign dinner at her venue. She would have thought he hated her for the way she treated him when she dumped him after prom. She squinted at her reflection in the mirror and touched up her lipstick. Who was she kidding? She was ridiculous to think he still cared about her enough to hate her. Adam was a senator now. And he was engaged. Yes. She knew everything about him. Whether she liked it or not, thanks to Mrs. Wheaton. No need to ever stalk Adam online with the steady stream of information provided for her. Every time she bumped into Mrs. Wheaton in town, whether it be in the park or the grocery store, the old busybody had an update about Adam's life. And a glamorous, successful life it had been. Graduated top of his class from Virginia Tech after receiving a full-ride scholarship their senior year. The list of achievements went on and on until he'd been elected senator. Clearly, this was a man who hardly gave her a second thought. His life was much too full. His eye was always on his next goal. Aubrey stuck her head in the powder room and said, "Can I just say that Senator Larson is a lot better looking in person?" Natasha turned to the younger girl, slipping back into her role as employer. "Did you get the hairdryer to him?" "Yeah, I even stuck around and watched him use it for a while. You know, in case he needed anything else. You were supposed to give it to him and come straight back." "He didn't see me," Aubrey assured her. "I watched through the crack in the door. I couldn't help myself. When I saw him take that shirt off and how ripped was, what was I supposed to do? I wanted to help him, but I felt like that would be taking it too far." Aubrey, he's a senator. I left before he took his pants off. But that was mostly because I saw his assistant coming down the hall. The future of this facility relies on our professionalism. And we need him to get re-elected because we desperately need the government funding. You know, things aren't looking great for us financially here. So, a senator. That's, like, government, right? Yes, Natasha said through gritted teeth. It's, like, government. Oh, well, he can govern me any day. Get back to work. I like the government, she said in a dreamy voice as she walked away. Natasha wiped a sweaty strand of hair from her forehead and blew out a breath of frustration. Her nerves were about to crack from the stress of her financial situation. If she didn't figure out how to get some money for her facility as soon as possible, she was going to lose everything. Aubrey turned around, a new light in her eyes. He's about your age, isn't he? Yes, I dated him in high school. Natasha immediately regretted the words the moment they left her mouth. Why was she admitting this to the daughter of the biggest gossip in town? Even if Aubrey repeated it to her mother, Mrs. Wheaton knew well enough of her history with Adam. But why let her know she was still dwelling on their history together? That would only add fuel to the fire she was sure Mrs. Wheaton was busy kindling this very moment. How could that old busybody resist with the senator walking the grounds of Natasha's establishment? In a burst of excitement, Aubrey said, "No way." "Really? You've kissed him?" "I would give anything to taste those lips." Natasha's cheeks blazed as she turned away from Aubrey to hide the blush on her cheeks. The last thing she wanted to think about was how his lips tasted. Oh, she remembered all right. How could she ever forget? Natasha surveyed the garden area behind the mansion. The dinner was well underway. Adam had done a spectacular job with his speech and had just sat down to eat his dinner. She noticed that none of her employees had made sure his water was filled, so she hurried over with the water pitcher. This time, she would be more careful with water and glass around Adam. When she arrived at his table, she stretched across for his glass, and her forearm brushed against his shoulder. She couldn't quite reach his glass. "Excuse me, would you mind handing me your glass?" Adam looked up at her, and only mere inches separated their faces. A thrill of electricity traveled down her spine as a rush of memories bombarded her at once. Memories she'd tried hard to forget. "Of course," he said, handing her the glass. As she took it from him, their fingers brushed, causing goosebumps to raise on her arms. As she filled his glass with water, she made sure to turn away so no water would spill on him. As she handed the glass back to him, Mrs. Wheaton ambled up, half out of breath. "Well, I was wondering when you two were going to bump into each other. Did you know she's running this place now? That girl sure has made a name for herself in this town. She's got ambition." Adam nervously tapped the glass with his fingertips. Natasha could see a flush of red spreading across his face. "Yep, we bumped into each other all right. I remember when I changed both of your diapers. Shoo-wee." She pinched her nose and waved her hand in front of her face. "I don't know which one of you stunk the most. I was the best babysitter in town back in those days. And now look where you are." Natasha cringed. Adam's face turned from red to green at the mention of those diapers. He set his fork down. "I'm so proud of you too." She grinned like she was the one who had raised them, revealing a full set of yellowing, crooked teeth. Natasha had learned years ago to stand back when Mrs. Wheaton talked, because not only did she have to dodge droplets of saliva, but her breath left something to be desired. "Senator Larson, how long are you in town for?" His face down, obviously trying to avoid being rude from the stench of her breath, he answered, "I'm heading out first thing in the morning." What a crying shame. I was going to invite the two of you over for breakfast. Walter just slaughtered our prized hog last week, and I have fresh bacon. Are you sure you can't squeeze in an extra hour for me? The idea of eating breakfast with Adam horrified her. She wanted to get away from him as quickly as she could. She didn't like the way her body reacted when she was in close proximity to him. I'm afraid I can't, Adam said. I have a tight schedule. I'm sure you understand with the campaign and all. Natasha felt a wave of relief wash over her. At least Adam seemed to have some sense about keeping the past in the past. I always thought the two of you were going to get married. Whatever happened anyway? Adam could speak to a room of 1,000+ people and debate the toughest competitors, but Natasha noticed he was at a loss for words when posed with this question. Mrs. Wheaton, Natasha said, grabbing a generous portion of the older woman's arm. Have you tried the lemon poppy seed muffins? They're my secret recipe. Why no, I haven't. I'm not one to turn down a muffin. Where are they? They're right over there at that table, Natasha said, pointing to the table across the lawn. Oh, goody! She clapped her hands together, and her arms looked like two wrinkled-up flags waving in the wind. She waddled in the direction of the muffins like an excited toddler ready for snack time. Natasha carried the last of the linens from the table spaced across the perfectly manicured lawn behind the mansion. She'd sent the rest of her staff home for the night. She just needed to drop the tablecloths off in the laundry room, and then she'd head upstairs to her personal quarters to retire for the night. She desperately needed to put her feet up. There was a pint of Ben and Jerry's calling to her from her freezer. Adam's dinner had been a raging success. The townspeople adored him and would be talking about the event for months. She had to admit that he looked ravishing in his suit. And he was an even better public speaker than he'd been when he was the student body president in high school. And he'd been fabulous back then. He'd inspired kids wherever he went. She walked to the back veranda and turned around to survey the property. It wasn't cheap to keep up the place, and it had been Natasha's dream to fix it up ever since she'd had her senior prom here. She couldn't explain it to herself. It was like she was somehow holding on to the past. Maybe that was stupid. But she'd run away from Adam. Maybe this was her way of holding on to the last beautiful memory they'd had together. That night had been magical. Lights strewn above the grassy dance floor, and fireflies blinking all around them as they danced. Everything had been perfect. Too perfect. And when Adam told her he was in love with her, she knew it couldn't last. Nothing that great lasted. She'd learned that when she was 12, when her dad died of cancer. So she ran away. None of that mattered now. She'd made her decision years ago, and Adam was getting married to another woman. She hoped he'd be happy, but she couldn't deny that it still hurt. She didn't understand it, but an ache had formed in her chest when she'd seen an announcement of his upcoming nuptials in the town paper. She should have moved on by now, but for some reason, the pain was still there. Maybe it was this place. It was a constant reminder of that magical night and the future she might have had with Adam. She'd spent a lot of years alone since then. There weren't exactly a lot of dating options in Maple Creek. Most of the men were married, or single by choice. Natasha entered the home through the back door and locked it up behind her. She dropped off the armload of linens in the laundry room, and her phone rang from where she'd left it on the kitchen counter. Natasha? The voice on the other line was familiar, but she couldn't quite place it. Yes? This is Jenny Larson, Adam's sister. He forgot his cell phone in the room we were using for him. Are you still there? We'd like to stop by to grab it. Jenny's casual tone caught Natasha off guard after acting in such a professional manner toward each other all day. There was something comforting about it. Like Jenny remembered how they all used to be. Well, I actually live here, Natasha said, relaxing into the conversation, so I won't be going anywhere for the rest of the night. I was planning to head to bed soon. What time do you think you'll be by? Within the next 5 minutes. We're at our parents' home just around the corner. Sure, come on by. I'm just putting away a few final items from the night, she said, putting a jar of pickles back into the refrigerator. We will be right there. True to her word, Jenny arrived with Adam 5 minutes later. Natasha spotted headlights pulling up the drive to the front of the mansion. Why did she suddenly feel her throat closing up at the thought of speaking to Adam again? She'd managed to successfully avoid him most of the day, speaking to Jenny only when absolutely necessary. As she watched him climb from his car, she had the urge to run upstairs to her bedroom and pull the covers over her head. But she didn't. Because she was a grown woman and a business owner. And she'd run from Adam before. She wasn't doing it again. Natasha lifted her chin and had assumed the poise of a southern lady by the time the knock sounded on her door. She swung the heavy mahogany door open to see Adam standing in the porch light beside his sister. Come in, she said. I apologize for the inconvenience, Adam said. As he stepped past her into the grand entryway, she caught a breath of his cologne. It smelled of sophistication and success. Definitely something expensive. Woodsy with a light hint of spice. A girl could get lightheaded inhaling too much of that. A flash of a memory hit her all at once, so powerful it almost left her reeling. Her first kiss with Adam. It was sophomore year. They'd snuck into the chemistry lab during lunch. It was one of those moments where time slowed down, where she remembered every detail for years. Because every second had been perfect. Adam turned to look at her sharply, almost as if he could read her thoughts. His eyes connected with hers, and she clamped her mouth together, shoving back the errant emotions into the dark recesses of her mind where they belonged. Is everything okay? He asked. Of course, she said, her voice smooth and even. Why wouldn't it be? She internally cursed herself. Was she really being that obvious? Or was Adam still in tune with her, even after all these years? No. That couldn't be it. That line of thinking was ridiculous and led down a path she refused to explore. Well, if it's all right with you, I'll just head back into the room where I think I may have left my phone. Right. Natasha felt like a fool. Her cheeks heated in embarrassment, and she was grateful she hadn't bothered to turn on the chandelier over them. Keeping her back to him so he wouldn't notice her red face, she led him into the lit hallway near the kitchen where she'd crashed into him earlier that day. Jenny got to the room before he did, and she looked around the enormous guest room. It was one of the rooms Natasha used for brides, getting ready for their special day. I hear congratulations are in order for you, she said to Adam. He turned to look at her, and she braced herself against the intensity of his gaze. It was harder than she'd imagined to keep from looking away. But she held her gaze against his. How's that? Your upcoming marriage? Oh. Yes, thank you, he said. That was it? Natasha remembered a time when conversation flowed freely between the two of them. It hurt to think they couldn't be friends anymore. I hear she's quite the catch, Natasha said. You're a lucky guy. A strange expression flitted across Adam's face, and his mouth twitched, like he had something to say but was holding the words back. His reaction caught her off guard. Why wasn't he immediately agreeing with her? How long have you known her? Frankly, I really don't think it's any of your business. Natasha blinked as his words smacked her in the face. I'm sorry, what? My relationship with Darla is private. A mix of hurt and anger swirled inside Natasha. I was only trying to be polite. If you want the honest truth, I care nothing about your relationship with Darla. You can see yourself out when you find your phone. It was a lie and tasted bitter on her tongue the moment she spoke it. She twisted on her heel and stalked away into the kitchen. She needed to find something to clean, or she would start throwing things. She grabbed a package of crackers and took it into the pantry to put it away. You don't get to pry into my business. You're not part of my life anymore. She whirled around to see that he had followed her into the gigantic pantry. She took a step away from him in shock. He was standing closer than she felt comfortable, and the proximity caused her pulse to race. She stared up into sharp blue eyes. So intense and full of an emotion she struggled to identify. Anger? Want? Desire and pain warred within her. Why did his words hurt so much? She hadn't spoken to him in years. She shouldn't care if she was part of his life. But she did. Not that she would admit it to him. You left me, Natasha. You ended things between us. That was your choice. Not mine. So, you don't get to ask about my private relationships. You lost that right when you left. It had been her choice. But she'd done it to protect herself. But now, a small, scared part of her was wondering what might have been. You didn't even explain yourself, he said, his voice quieter now. You wouldn't have understood. That's easy for you to say. You didn't even give me a chance to understand. You just shut me out. I was just a kid. Just a kid? You were Adam Larson. Invincible. Like Superman. It hurt, Natasha. I still don't know what I did wrong. And I think that's what hurts the worst. You didn't trust me enough to talk things out with me. Do you know what it's like to spend 10 years wondering if there's something broken about you? Natasha had to look away from the pain in Adam's eyes. She'd been so brave to face him before, but this was getting to be too much. She turned to leave the pantry, but the door swung shut on its own, the lock clicking from the outside. What the dash? Natasha jerked on the doorknob, but it didn't budge. Panic rose in her chest. She had to get away from Adam and quickly. Jenny? She banged on the door. Can you hear me? What's going on? Adam asked, moving close to her. Somehow the door swung shut and locked from the outside. Here, let me try. Natasha stepped aside and let Adam attempt to open the door. But he didn't seem to have any better luck. Jenny, he called. Laughter floated through the door. Deep belly laughs. This really is too great. Very funny, Jenny, Adam said in a tired voice. Can you please unlock the door and let us out of here? I'm exhausted. I've had an extremely long day. I just want to get my cell phone and go home. You know what? Jenny said. I don't think I will. You two obviously have some catching up to do. And since Natasha loves to run away without facing her feelings, this is the perfect opportunity to talk things out. You have got to be kidding me, Natasha said. Nope, Jenny replied. I'm not kidding. I'm not letting you two out until you work things out between the two of you. Adam, you clearly don't love Darla. You know that as well as I do. Don't throw your life away on the wrong woman. Besides, I really don't want her as a sister-in-law. She makes my skin crawl. Jenny! Open the door right now. Adam demanded. You can't just leave us in here, Natasha insisted. Jenny was officially insane. She'd completely lost it. Natasha, you live upstairs, right? Jenny asked in a chipper tone. Yes, Natasha answered with hesitation. Whatever Jenny had in mind couldn't be good. Do you mind if I crash upstairs and make myself at home? I'm getting the impression that you guys might be a while. I mean, if your little fight is any sign. This is ridiculous. Adam sounded like he was saying it through gritted teeth. I'm calling the police, Natasha said. You won't get away with this. What are you going to call them with? Your cell phone is sitting right here on the counter. You've been running away from Adam for far too long. I'm not going to let my brother make the worst mistake of his life. Anyway, I'll talk to Dave at the police station and explain the situation to him. I'm sure he'll understand. Jenny and Dave were best friends from 3rd grade all the way through high school. Even if she had her phone, there wasn't a chance he would put a stop to her antics. He'd probably think it was hilarious. And it wasn't like Adam had his phone. Jenny still hadn't given it to him. She was probably holding it right now. You don't, by chance, have another phone on you, do you? Natasha dared to look over at Adam. He let out a curt laugh. No. Unfortunately, not. Well, you two lovebirds have fun in there. I'm going upstairs to see if Natasha has anything good to eat. Have fun! Jenny's cheerful tone set Natasha's teeth on edge. Jenny's retreating footsteps sounded through the door, and panic rose inside of her. No, no, no. Natasha banged on the door. Jenny! You can't just leave us in here. Jenny! She kept banging and protesting until her hands were red and her throat was hoarse. Finally, she turned to Adam. He leaned against the pantry shelf with his arms crossed. If you think that will get her to come down here, then you don't know my sister very well. She's the most stubborn person I've ever met. When she sets her mind to something, there's no talking her out of it. Great, Natasha said, leaning against the locked door in defeat. What are we going to do now? Adam sighed heavily and looked around the large pantry. Do you have any good snacks in here? Natasha looked at him and quirked a brow. Do I have any good snacks? PSH. It's not like I run a catering service or anything. She scanned the shelves. What are you in the mood for? I have mixed nuts, crackers, gourmet cookies, left over from last night's wedding, olives, pickles. And, of course, butter mints. I'll take the mixed nuts and some of those cookies. Natasha handed him a plastic jar of nuts and the storage container of cookies. Adam opened the lid on the container and peered at the cookies inside. What kind of cookies are these? Chocolate chip macadamia. Alexis at the bakery in town makes them. Have you ever had her stuff? Alexis from high school? Adam asked. She owns the bakery now? Yep. Did she ever get married? Adam asked. She never did. What about Lauren? He asked, referring to Natasha's best friend in high school. They'd all hung out together. She got married right out of high school and had a kid, but she ended up getting divorced. She owns a hair salon in town now. Why do you ask? Natasha teased. Are you interested? I have a fiancé, remember? Oh, right. Natasha took a cookie and bit into it. She chewed and swallowed before saying, and it seems to be going pretty well, according to your sister. What was she talking about, anyway? It's private. You might as well tell me. It might help us come up with a plan of how to convince Jenny to let us out.
Chapter 3. Adam sighed. Natasha had a point. He hadn't wanted to talk about his relationship with Darla for two reasons. First, it was weird to talk about with Natasha because of their history. Second, he didn't want to admit to Natasha how badly things were going. He could hardly admit it to himself. Jenny didn't miss a thing. Fred had pushed him into this relationship, and as much as he tried, he struggled to find a deep connection with Darla. The longer he spent time with her, the more he realized just how bad their relationship was for him. He hadn't wanted to admit it to himself for a long time, but being around Natasha was bringing back the very memories he'd fought so hard to keep buried for the past 10 years. And being locked in the pantry with her wasn't helping matters. He glanced over at where she sat perched on the counter that ran the length of the pantry. She still wore the white shirt tucked into the pencil skirt. He hoped for her sake that Jenny wouldn't keep them in there for very long. Her clothing didn't look very comfortable. He dusted off 2 cookies and a handful of nuts, but he got sick of them pretty quickly. The saltiness of the nuts made him thirsty. He looked around for something to quench his thirst. He spotted a can of peaches with one of those metal lids he could open by pulling a tab. "Care if I eat these peaches?" he asked. He figured she wouldn't care, but it was always a good idea to be polite and ask first. "Go for it." He pulled the tab on the top of the can, and it popped off faster than he'd expected, cutting his finger. Ouch. Great. He'd sliced himself pretty deeply. Blood began to ooze from the wound. Natasha? You okay? Do you have a first aid kit in here somewhere?" He searched the shelves, but all he saw was neat rows of canned goods and wedding snacks. "I should. In the meantime, we can get a paper towel around it to stop the bleeding. I always keep my spare paper towels in here." She went to the back corner of the pantry and ripped open a fresh roll of paper towels. She tore off a sheet and walked closer to him. "Let me see your finger." Adam allowed her to take his hand in hers. Her hands were warm and soft. He sucked in a breath. He hadn't expected her touch to have this effect on him again after all those years. But it was like no time had passed at all. She folded a paper towel into a long strip and then wound it around his finger, keeping pressure on the cut. He felt her gaze on his face before he saw it. He looked up into her eyes, and warmth flowed through him. She bit her lip, and his eyes lingered on her mouth, the action catching his attention. He remembered her lips like it was yesterday. Kissing Darla had never been like that for him. He'd never felt a connection with a woman like he had with Natasha. He'd tried to convince himself that he'd just been caught up in teenage hormones. That grown adults had serious relationships. But now that he was with Natasha again, he was wondering if he'd gotten it wrong. Maybe it hadn't been the fact that they were teens dealing with an overload of hormones, but that he had an undeniably powerful connection with this woman. A connection he hadn't felt with another woman since. Nothing had come remotely close. Natasha pulled her hands away, and he felt a void where her touch had been. "That paper towel will not last for very long. Let me see if I can find that first aid kit." She went to the sturdy wooden ladder that reached to the upper shelves of the massive pantry. Whoever had built this home had spared no expense, and the pantry was no exception. He'd never seen such an impressive pantry. With a setup like this, he could see why Natasha catered the weddings herself. Natasha slipped off her heels and climbed the ladder. Adam had to look away to keep from seeing up her skirt as she navigated the upper levels of the shelves. "Found it," Natasha announced. "Here. Come, take it from me so I can climb down in this ridiculous skirt. I wasn't expecting to deal with this ladder when I picked it out for the day." Keeping his eyes focused on Natasha's face, Adam walked over to where she was perched on the ladder and took the white box with the red cross from her grasp. "Thanks." Natasha began climbing back down, and Adam set the first aid kit on the granite countertop, something that must have been a more recent update to the home. It was too trendy looking to be original. He fumbled with the latches on the box, but the bulk of the paper towel around his hand made it cumbersome to release them. "Here," Natasha said, coming up next to him, having made it successfully down the ladder. "Let me." She took the box from him, brushing her hands against his as she lifted it from his grasp. She easily released the latches and opened the box. She rummaged through the gauze and bandages, pulling items from the box and setting them onto the granite surface below. "Give me your hand," she instructed. He obeyed, putting his hand into hers. She ripped open an alcohol swab package and pulled out the small white square. She uncoiled the paper towel from his finger and inspected his wound. "It looks like the bleeding has slowed down a bit." She swiped the alcohol over his cut, and he winced. "Ow. Ow," she scoffed. "You always were such a big baby when it came to getting hurt. Remember the time you got in a bike wreck, and I had to bandage you up? You'd only scraped your knee, but I would have thought you'd broken your femur from the way you were acting. That's not true. Plus, that really hurt. Haven't you ever scraped your knee? And you poured peroxide over my road rash. It was killer." Natasha rolled her eyes. "See what I mean? You can speak to an enormous crowd and not bat an eye, but you freak out at the tiniest cut." I hardly freaked out. I think I said ouch or something. Do you know how often I cut myself working in this kitchen? Glass breaks, knives slip. There's no time to freak out. You just have to keep going when 200 people are relying on you to feed them or a bride wants her day to be perfect. Natasha squirted antibiotic cream onto a bandage and wrapped it around his wounded finger. "You make it seem like I have no struggle at all with public speaking," Adam whispered. "Because that's the way it looks. Are you saying you struggle getting up in front of people?" "Yes. That's what I'm saying. I've always been terrified of speaking in front of large crowds. You would think it gets easier with time. It doesn't. But I do it anyway. Because that's what the job requires." He spotted a giant box of plastic silverware on a shelf near the back of the pantry and opened it to find a fork for his peaches. He fished one out and closed the box before returning to the can of peaches he'd left on the countertop when he'd gotten injured. He stuck the fork into the can and speared a peach, taking a bite of the sweet, juicy fruit. "Huh," Natasha said. "I never would have guessed that you got nervous. You make it look so easy. You're so polished up there. You always have been like that. Even in high school. I never told you this, but I threw up before my student body president acceptance speech in high school." "You're kidding. You completely rocked that speech. You had the entire school eating right out of your hand." He looked at the fruit and made a face. Somehow, after talking about throwing up, eating this peach isn't so appetizing anymore. Natasha laughed. "That is gross. I was actually just thinking the same thing. Why does this keep happening to me today? This is the second time I've tried to eat when something gross was talked about. I can't believe Mrs. Wheaton talking about our dirty diapers at the dinner. I can't catch a break." Natasha smiled. Your face was turning green. "That reminds me of the time we made ice cream sundaes and Jimmy Meadows puked all over everyone's dessert. Didn't that one kid eat his, anyway? What was his name?" Adam asked. "Herbert Batkins." "That's right. Good old Herbert. He always stole the last slice of pizza when he thought no one was looking. He picked his nose and ate it when he thought no one was looking too." Adam laughed. "I remember that. But I also remember you befriending him when everyone else was mean," Natasha pointed out. "That was something that really attracted me to you. I never forgot that about you." Where was she going with this? Adam thought she hated him. "Why did you break up with me all those years ago, Natasha?" She was quiet for a long moment, and he looked up from his can of peaches. Her brow was furrowed, and he wondered if he'd made a mistake by bringing it up. Wasn't it better to leave the past in the past? "Do you remember when my dad died from cancer when I was 12? Natasha finally said. Her question caught him off guard. He wasn't sure where she was going with the change of subject. "I remember. You never talked about it much, though. When we went to prom, everything was so perfect. It was probably the best night of my life until then. Maybe ever." It's why I bought this place with the inheritance my grandmother left for me. Not that I'll be able to keep it. Why wouldn't you be able to keep it? Natasha looked away with an uncomfortable expression. I'm barely holding on financially. I had enough money from my inheritance to put half down on this house, but I used a private lender for the rest. He recently died, and his widow is calling in my loan. She's not interested in going into the money lending business and needs the money to live on herself since her husband is gone. I've been trying to get a loan with a bank, but I haven't been able to get one yet. I'm sorry to hear that. I hope you're able to get a loan. Natasha shrugged. It is what it is. If I don't get a loan, then I'll just have to reconfigure my life. Adam wanted to say something to make it better for Natasha, but he couldn't think of a single word to fix her problems. So much of his life had gone well. He wanted all the best things for Natasha too. I have a question, he asked. You said that our prom night was perfect. Why destroy something so perfect by ending our relationship? It made little sense. Because it was too perfect. And nothing that perfect lasts. Not for me, anyway. Why would you think something like that? You deserve to be happy just as much as anyone. When my dad died, it hurt so much. I didn't know how to carry that much pain with me. I didn't want anyone else to experience it, so I held it all inside. My dad and I were always so close. When he died, it almost killed me. I can't explain it. But I learned that people I loved left, and that if I ever let someone into my heart like that again, I could hurt that much again. When you told me you loved me that night, I knew I loved you back, Adam, and I couldn't allow it. It was too dangerous. So I pushed you away. I ran, and then I broke up with you the next Monday. It was safer that way. Adam usually had all the right words. He was a man who thrived on finding solutions for tough problems. But he didn't have any answers for Natasha. How could he stop the bleeding in her heart? There was no first aid kit for a wounded heart. No gauze or bandages would help in this situation. I wish I'd known how much you were hurting. I could have helped you get through it if you'd just open up to me. I didn't want to burden you. Grief isn't fun. We were young and in high school. We were supposed to be getting shakes and burgers and laughing. I didn't want to ruin everyone else's lives like mine had been ruined. Adam stepped closer to her. Telling me you were hurting because you missed your dad wouldn't have ruined anything. I would have been there for you. Natasha sighed. It's in the past. I've had years of therapy since then. I've learned that it's healthy to talk about my feelings, which is why I'm even okay with sharing this much with you. I appreciate you trusting me enough with your feelings, to be so honest. I know that couldn't have been easy for you. Natasha looked up into his face. She was only inches away from him. He could smell the floral scent of her perfume, and it made him want to pull her close to him so he could bury his face in her hair and breathe in her smell like he'd done so many times when they'd been together. You're right, she said. I should have confided in you all those years ago about how much I was hurting from losing my dad. You're an excellent listener. Her eyes locked on his, and they stood like that for a moment as time stopped. Her eyes were luminous in the pantry light, and he was close enough to smell her perfume. Her long blonde waves looked soft, and he longed to run his hands through it. She bit her bottom lip, drawing his eyes to her mouth. He had the sudden urge to kiss her, and he probably would have if he hadn't been engaged to Darla. Being this close to Natasha again was intoxicating. The memories of their time together flooded into his mind. Days filled with an overabundance of happiness and laughter. Pure joy like he hadn't known since. Would he ever get that back? He ached for it more than he had since the last moment he'd set eyes on Natasha all those years ago at their high school graduation. He'd kept hoping she would change her mind about ending their relationship. But nothing he had said would persuade her to get back together with him. He'd watched her getting into her car after the ceremony, and he now realized that she'd taken a piece of his heart that he'd never gotten back. It would be so easy to put it back into place. Like finding the missing piece of a jigsaw puzzle that had been sitting out on the table for the last 10 years and snapping it into the hole. He hadn't fully realized that hole still existed until now. Unless he had Natasha, it would always exist, taunting him with what might have been. He needed to step away before he made a choice he'd regret later. He'd promised to marry Darla, to love and cherish her. He didn't take that vow lightly. He turned from Natasha and stabbed another peach from the can. He ate in silence for a few minutes, and the air hung thick between them. When he finally looked up from his empty can, he saw Natasha gazing off into the corner of the pantry, like she wasn't really seeing anything in front of her. Like she was a lifetime away. He suddenly felt tired. How was he supposed to sleep in here, anyway? Surely Jenny would let them out before it got too late. They had to get on the road the next day. He couldn't stay up all night, locked up in this ridiculous pantry. How long do you think Jenny will take to come back down? I don't know, but I hope it's soon. This isn't exactly my most comfortable outfit. She looked down at her tight skirt. While it looked amazing on her, Adam imagined she was ready to change into a pair of sweats. He tugged on his tie, loosening it enough to pull over his head. He placed it on the counter and unbuttoned the first 2 buttons of his shirt. He'd meant to change once he'd gotten home, but as soon as he'd taken his jacket off, he realized he'd forgotten his cell phone at the mansion. In a panic, he'd rushed straight over. "Do you think she planned this?" Adam asked. "How could she? It wasn't like she knew we'd end up in the pantry together or even that it locked," Natasha pointed out. After a moment of silence, she asked, "Is it true, what Jenny said?" "About what?" "That you don't love your fiancée." Adam hesitated. He wasn't sure he knew how to talk to Natasha about Darla. "Darla and I have a complex relationship." He knew he was being vague, but maybe that was the point. It wasn't a subject he enjoyed bringing up with anyone, not even himself. He had an understanding with Darla. They were a team. Sure, she could be distant, but she was an excellent asset to his campaign. "Your sister was right. You shouldn't marry her." "What makes you say that?" "Because you deserve better than a complex relationship. You deserve something beautiful and strong. A straightforward relationship where you don't have to hesitate or stop to think how you will explain and make excuses for your relationship. You should answer immediately with no doubt in your mind that you are head over heels in love with your soulmate." Adam knew she was right, but he didn't want to admit it to her, and he didn't want to admit it to himself. Because then he'd have to change something. And what about his campaign? If he broke things off with Darla, he'd have to face some consequences he wasn't sure he was willing to face.
Chapter 4. Natasha sat quietly, mulling over the words she just said to Adam. She wondered what he was thinking. His silence bothered her. She felt terrible for leaving him when they were younger. But maybe it was time to put the past behind her. She'd spent the last 10 years wallowing in guilt over her decision. Not so much for Adam, but for the hurt she'd caused herself. She figured Adam would move on and find a wonderful woman to spend his life with. But she hadn't been able to find anyone who came remotely close to how wonderful Adam was. And she realized that she'd made a terrible mistake by leaving him all those years ago. She'd let her fear and her grief overcome her. If what Jenny was saying was right, that he didn't love Darla, that meant Adam hadn't been able to find anyone who filled his heart in the past 10 years. It made her heart ache for him. For what he'd lost. Because of her. She'd ruined both their futures. But what could he do? It didn't sound like Adam was willing to do anything about his less than perfect relationship with Darla. If he was content with spending the rest of his life with someone who he'd chosen for his career instead of love, then how could she stop him? Who was she to stop him, anyway? She'd lost that right 10 years ago when she walked out on their relationship. And had she overcome her fear of being left, anyway? What was to prevent Adam from giving it a shot with her, only to realize she wasn't that great? He'd end up leaving her, anyway. Had anything really changed inside her in the last 10 years? She wanted to hope so, but she hadn't been in a serious enough relationship to put her fears to the test. No one had mattered as much as Adam. Maybe she was a fool for thinking she even had a chance with him again. How could she compete with perfectly beautiful Darla? Wealthy, famous Darla. And how was Natasha supposed to support Adam in a career when she had a struggling business on the brink of collapse? Yes. She was definitely a fool. An exhausted fool. She looked around. I have a feeling Jenny fell asleep upstairs. So, we can either bang on the walls and wake her up, or we can try to figure out a way to sleep in here. I don't have the energy to mess with Jenny tonight. You're right. We should get some rest. Jenny's probably passed out on my bed with my pint of Ben and Jerry's. Adam stood and looked around the pantry. Do you have anything we can use as bedding? I have some tablecloths in the bottom cabinet over there, she said, pointing to the corner of the room. If we stack them up enough, we could make them soft enough to be tolerable. Adam opened the cabinet she'd indicated, and he pulled out a few stacks of tablecloths. Natasha was glad she'd gotten caught up on the laundry this last week. There would be enough for them to make 2 separate beds. The only problem was that there wasn't enough floor space in the pantry for them to space out head to head. They would have to make their beds side by side, and they'd only be about an inch apart. Their night could get awkward quickly. Natasha took half of the tablecloths and began folding them into the size and shape of a bedroll. We will have to sleep close, she said. You don't snore, do you? She asked. Not that I know of, Adam said with a chuckle. Good. Because I'm a light sleeper. She looked at him with a grin. Actually, I might be the one to wake you up. I have nightmares sometimes. Sometimes was an understatement. She had them most nights. Natasha laid out her bedroll and slipped inside. She was glad the light switch for the pantry was on the inside so they could turn it off for the night. Can you turn off the light? She asked. Sure. Adam flipped it off, immersing the room in darkness. She hoped it wouldn't be too horrible of a night. The coolness of the marble floor seeped into her, and she sighed as she drifted off to sleep. When she woke the next morning, Adam's arm was over her torso. She gently removed it, setting it beside his sleeping form. She remembered him calming her quietly and swiftly in the night, and the nightmares didn't return after that. Her joints were stiff, but she'd slept well other than that. There was something calming about sleeping next to Adam. She felt safe with him near her. Something about it broke her heart. Would she ever get to sleep next to him like this again? She usually woke a few times during the night with nightmares, but for the first time in a long time, she'd slept peacefully. Was this peaceful feeling how she would have felt waking for the past 10 years if she hadn't given up on him? Had she spent the last 10 years tossing and turning with nightmares when she could have had Adam and the peace he seemed to cast over her when she was around him instead? Ever since her dad died, she'd fought off anxiety. The years she'd spent dating Adam in high school had been the lightest years for her anxiety. He'd been able to cast a peace over her life that no one else could seem to bring. Not even her cat, Cuddles. After she broke up with him, her anxiety had come back in full force, only worse. She hadn't made the connection until now. She just spent the night locked up in a pantry with her ex-boyfriend. Her anxiety should have skyrocketed. The more she thought about it, the more she realized what he could mean for her life. She had to tell him how she felt. She sat up, and he rolled over to look at her. What time is it? He asked. I have no idea. My guess is around 7, judging by the amount of light coming under the door. Adam moved like he was trying to get up. Do you mind if I turn on the light? Adam, before you do, I have something I want to say to you. He stopped moving. I owe you a big apology. I never should have broken up with you like that. I know I really hurt you. But honestly, looking back, I see now that it was a terrible mistake. I let my fear get in the way and take control. I know you've moved on and you have Darla in your life, but I want to make things right between us. Can we be friends? Of course, we can be friends, Adam said. I'd like that. You're sure Darla won't mind? Adam laughed. No. I can guarantee she won't mind. His response bothered her. What kind of relationship did they have, anyway? Was it just for show? She'd known Jenny fairly well since she was always hanging around while she'd been dating Adam. Jenny was a good sister. She could spot a fake friend from a mile away. There was no pulling the wool over her eyes. If she didn't like Darla, she would have a good reason. And apparently, she hated Darla enough to lock Adam up in the pantry with Natasha overnight. She had to be desperate. What was Adam walking into? I'm guessing that Jenny will be awake soon. What are we going to tell her when she comes to open this door? We tell her we're friends now. I don't know, because I felt something with you last night. Natasha, Adam's voice grew quiet. I'm not sure I can let myself go there with you again. Pain crept into her chest. Why not? Please don't take this the wrong way. I fully respect that you've struggled a lot with the loss of your father. But I don't know if I can handle going down a path that may lead to you ultimately leaving me again. You mean you don't want to invest in someone you can't trust to stick around when the relationship gets too serious? It hurt. A lot. But she understood where he was coming from. She couldn't blame him. She'd crushed his heart once. What was keeping her from doing it again? Were the years of therapy enough to help her survive a serious relationship? Yes, he said in a somber voice. That's what I mean. So, you're saying you still have feelings for me? It wasn't a question. I can't deny how I feel about you, Natasha. I've tried to bury my emotions for years. No matter how hard I've thrown myself into my studies or my career, I still think about you when it's late at night and the world has gone to sleep. And that most likely won't end after you marry Darla. I'd thought about coming to see you on this trip to put my feelings for you behind me. Because I owe it to Darla. But you just said that Darla won't care if we're friends, Natasha pointed out. And now you're saying you still have feelings for me. If I were in her shoes, I wouldn't let you near me. I told you, my relationship with Darla is complex. Adam crossed his arms in a defensive stance. Care to explain what that means? Natasha presses. It means that Darla may not care as much about respecting marriage as I do. Why was he being so stubborn? Anger burned at the unfairness of it all. If you respect marriage so much, then why are you marrying someone when you're still thinking of another woman? A tortured expression crossed Adam's face, and before he could respond, the door swung open and Jenny stood in the doorway. Good morning, lovebirds. I didn't mean to leave you two in here overnight. I kinda sorta fell asleep and just woke up. I hope you guys. She must have noticed the look on Adam's face because she stopped mid-sentence. Are you guys hungry? I can make breakfast. Breakfast would be great, Natasha said, grateful she didn't pry into what had just transpired between them while locked up. Jenny was a very intuitive person. She must have figured from the look on Adam's face that whatever needed to be talked about during their lockup was unearthed. Do you like eggs? Jenny asked. I make a killer breakfast burrito. No, Adam said abruptly. I'm not hungry. I want to go home. He brushed past Jenny and snatched his phone from where Jenny must have left it on the counter. Jenny watched his behavior with a frown. There's no need to be rude, Adam. No rudeness intended. I just would like to go home and shower. Natasha had spent the last 10 years running from Adam. Now that he was running from her, she understood how much she must have hurt Adam and how much she wanted him in her life to stay. Adam. Natasha followed him to the grand entrance of the home. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to pry. I told you my relationship with Darla was private. She took a deep breath. I love you, Adam. He stopped and turned to her. I know it may be 10 years too late to tell you this. But I wanted to tell you I loved you back that night at prom. I was just too scared. You deserve to know. And now I know I still do. And I always will. I'm sorry, but you're right. It is 10 years too late. But we're different people now. Adam walked out the door, taking Natasha's heart with him.
Chapter 5. Adam sat in the car for only a few minutes before Jenny emerged from the mansion. She climbed into the car next to him. What just happened in there? Adam shook his head. Can we not talk about this right now? Jenny clamped her mouth shut with a frustrated scowl. But Adam didn't care. She'd overstepped too far this time. His heart felt like it had been ripped in two, and he had to get some space and time to think. She stayed silent until they got to their parents' home. He got out of the car and went into the house. The smell of bacon cooking filled the air, and his mom looked up from the skillet when she saw him enter. Adam? Is everything okay? She set the spatula down and walked toward him. Do I look that bad? He asked. Jenny's been keeping me in the loop. She shouldn't have locked you up all night. But I'm glad you finally talked things over with Natasha. You've had unfinished business with her for far too long. I don't know what to do, Mom. It was an unusual feeling for him. He spent his life with a well-thought-out plan for everything he did. But loyalty was more important to him than anything. And he'd made a promise to Darla. What's the concern? She turned off the stove and pulled out a chair and took a seat. The bacon can wait. Sit. Let's talk. Adam hesitated. He'd planned to go straight to the shower, but maybe talking to his mom would help him clear his head. He pulled out the chair next to her and settled into it. The words poured from his mouth. He told her everything that had happened from the moment Natasha spilled the water on him to the last moment he saw her when she declared her love for him. Adam, I knew that girl still loved you. I've seen it for years. Why did you let me get engaged to Darla then? Like we could have done anything to stop you. When you get your mind set to something, you're like a freight train headed for your next goal. All we really want for you, son, is to be happy. Do you think Darla will be the woman to bring you joy for the next 60 years of your life? Because that's what this is about. You don't need her to bolster your career. You got elected the first time without Darla. You can do it again. I made a promise to Darla. I can't break that promise. Adam, I think Darla is in love with the idea of having the big wedding she's always dreamed of. When the honeymoon is over, she may have a rude awakening. And so will you. That doesn't change the fact that Natasha left me once over her father's death and her inability to allow herself to get too attached to another person. What's keeping her from running away again after when she realizes how much she cares? I think she just realized that this morning when she told you she was in love with you. And I didn't even give her a chance to make things right, Adam mused. If you're not willing to take risks, then how will you ever discover the best this life has to offer? His mom asked. You're saying I'm being too cautious? I'm letting you know that sometimes you have to put yourself out there and know that love is scary and powerful. It can completely crush a person or to bring them deep, lasting joy. If you aren't willing to put your heart on the line, then you may miss out on the love of your life. You deserve that. Everyone deserves that. And Darla deserves to be with a husband who loves her. Everything clicked into place for him in that moment. Natasha was in love with him as much as he'd been and still was in love with her. Opportunities like that came once in a lifetime. And that meant he needed to break things off with Darla. For once in his life, he threw caution to the wind. 2 weeks later, Adam returned to Maple Creek. This time he came alone. He'd broken off his engagement the night before. Darla was pretty upset, but he later realized that she was more disappointed about losing out on her over-the-top wedding than she was about losing out on him. After a call to Mrs. Wheaton, he got in contact with her daughter Aubrey, who worked for Natasha. Between the two Wheaton women, he was able to launch his plan into action, hopefully without Natasha finding out. He pulled up to the Whitmore house and met Aubrey out front. "Hi, Senator Larson. Do you have everything ready?" "Yep. I sure do." She handed him a large white rectangular box. He followed her through the home to the back garden area. Twilight had just fallen, and the grassy area was set up with twinkling lights strung overhead just like he'd remembered all those years ago at prom. "How's it look?" Aubrey asked. "Did I do it okay?" "I tried to get it as close to your yearbook picture as I could." "Aubrey, you did a perfect job." He wrung his hands. His familiar fear of public speaking set upon him again. Only this was much worse. He was used to convincing people to believe in him, but with Natasha it wasn't his career on the line. This time it was his heart, body, and soul. "My mom should be back with Natasha any minute. She texted me just before you got here, saying they were on their way. And Natasha has no idea, right?" "As far as I know, she doesn't. My mom just convinced her to come out of the house by telling her she wanted to donate her entire teacup collection to Whitmore House for the big auction Natasha has planned to save the place. If all went as planned, Natasha wouldn't be struggling any more financially. His investment portfolio had earned a sizable sum of money over the last several years, more than enough to save her business. He planned to offer to go in as a partner in the ownership of the Whitmore House. Strictly as a business venture. He heard Mrs. Wheaton's unmistakable southern drawl before he saw the two of them emerge from the back of the house onto the massive veranda. He stood under the twinkling lights, and on cue, Aubrey hit play on her phone. Music filled the air, the song they danced to at their senior prom. "What's all this?" Natasha said, taking in the twinkle lights and Adam standing in the middle of her lawn wearing a suit. He opened the box, revealing a giant chocolate macadamia cookie with the words "Will you forgive me?" frosted on the top. He'd gotten Alexis from the bakery to make it for him special this morning. Natasha bit her bottom lip, her eyes glassy with unshed tears. "I'm very sorry for the way I walked out on you 2 weeks ago when we last met. I love you more now than I ever loved you before. I went home, and I realized I don't want to live without you. Spending our time in the pantry showed me how much you still mean to me. Waking up next to you was incredible, even if the floor was hard and it was a miserable way to sleep. So, I'm asking you for a do-over. And what better way than to reenact our senior prom?" Natasha covered a laugh with her hand as tears poured down her face. "I forgive you, but only on one condition." "What's that?" Adam asked. "That you dance with me once again." His smile stretched wide across his face. "I was hoping you'd say that." He took her in his arms just like he had that May night years ago at their prom. She looped her arms around his neck, and he pulled her close. She leaned her head on his shoulder, and they swayed in rhythm to the music. She smelled amazing, like wildflowers on a sunny spring morning. How long had he longed for this moment? When the song ended, she pulled back and looked into his eyes. He focused on her lips and couldn't hold back a moment longer. He took her mouth with his, kissing her slowly and gently at first. He deepened the kiss, pulling her closer to his torso. In that moment everything felt perfect. He pulled away and looked into her beautiful eyes. "So, does this mean I get another chance?" "Yes. 100 times, yes." He took her face in his hands and kissed her again.
Epilogue. 1 year later. Lauren Parker put the finishing touches on her best friend Natasha's hair. While she'd done more wedding updos than she could count, she'd never done it in her own maid of honor dress. They'd headquartered their pre-wedding beauty preparations in Natasha's rooms on the top floor of the Whitmore house. "I still can't believe that after all these years, you and Adam are finally getting together for good." Natasha smiled at her through their reflection in the mirror she was facing. "I can hardly believe it myself. I thought I was doomed to be single for the rest of my life. I'd almost convinced myself that it was what I wanted. It's a good thing you came along, Jenny." Jenny was across the room in her pink bridesmaid's dress, dusting Alexis's cheeks with blush. The 4 bridesmaids had all gone to school together. After 10 years, other than Lauren's disastrous marriage to her ex-husband, Natasha was the first of them to get married. "Let's all promise to have our weddings here at the Whitmore house one day," Jenny said. Lauren scoffed. "Yeah, right. I'm staying single for the rest of my life. I've done the marriage thing, thank you very much, and I'm perfectly happy to run my little salon in peace." If she could keep her salon, anyway. She'd inherited it from her dear grandmother, and the finances were a complete disaster. She barely had enough left over to feed herself, let alone her 4-year-old daughter. She'd need a miracle to keep her doors open, and soon. But her friends didn't need to know about that. Today was about Natasha and Adam. "Now that Adam's been re-elected, what are you doing with the Whitmore house?" Lauren asked. "Well, you know Adam ended up investing in the place, right?" Natasha said. "No, I didn't realize that," Lauren said. "Yeah. The place was on the brink of financial collapse. I wouldn't have been able to keep it if it weren't for him. So, who will run it now? I'll still have a hand in the major decisions, but the Aubrey will run the day-to-day operations." "Mrs. Wheaton's daughter?" "Yes. She's shown real promise. So far, I'm impressed with her. She's come a long way since I first hired her. I think it was because Adam believed in her. He trusted her to set up the place for me as a big surprise when we ended up getting back together. She did a fantastic job setting up the backyard to look just like it did when we'd had prom all those years ago. She had nothing but a yearbook photo and Adam's description to go off of. I was dazzled. It looked just like it did that night. Since then, she's entered an apprenticeship. And she's completely rocking it. Well, that should take a big load off your mind now that you'll be a senator's wife," Lauren said with a smile. "Speaking of," Jenny said. "It's time we got downstairs. You have a senator to marry." Natasha's cheeks glowed as Lauren placed the veil over her head. Lauren's heart warmed to see her best friend so happy. If only she would have been able to find her own happily ever after. She would have to spend her life basking in the happiness of others. For her, that's all there was. Surely, you don't believe that, right? Grab her rock star's dark secret to discover if Lauren finds her own happily ever after.
This has been Her Senator's Second Chance by Cindy Ray Hale. Copyright 2020 Cindy Ray Hale.